Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Leadership in Insurance podcast, otherwise known as the LiiP. I'm your host, Alex Bonds, and I'm very lucky today to be joined by Dickie Whitaker of Oasis Loss Modelling Framework. And Oasis, there's multiple strings to your bow, sir. So I thought it might be better to welcome you to the show first. So welcome, good morning.
Good morning, Alex. Thanks very much for your time.
No, not at all. And please introduce people that may not know, what is Oasis and what it is exactly that you do.
Okay, well, I'll do it quite quickly. But essentially, about 8 years ago, I started a company called Oasis Loss Modelling Framework. So that was there to try and solve a problem which exists in the insurance and reinsurance industry and outside, for that matter, which relates to being able to understand risk using this paradigm called catastrophe modelling. And really, we're there to try and democratize the understanding of risk, which is a sort of shorthand for that one. But I also started another company after that called Oasis Hub, and that's about a sort of portal for innovation for environmental data. So we've got that one too. And then there are actually two other companies that I started or co-founded. All of these things I sort of co-founded. One called the LiiP Risk Network, which funds research, and one called Oasis Palm Tree, which is a consulting firm that sits around the sort of Oasis family. So that's my portfolio that I've got at the moment.
That's why I passed it over to you, because I thought I'm not going to stumble over the multitude of things that you're involved with. You probably haven't had a lot of spare time this year, then, one would imagine.
No, I mean, I started them because actually I might describe myself as I do describe myself as a problem solver. I think that's what that's what the world needs in many ways. Talking about stuff is fine, but actually you got to roll up your sleeves and solve problems. And I sort of realized that some of these things just weren't going to go away unless somebody actually did something about it. So I sort of started the companies to solve specific problems, and I'm not entirely sure that's the best way of doing it, but anyway, it's the way I did do it. So here we are.
Well, I mean, I think that's a good way to start a company. I mean, that actually came up the other day. Someone said to me that you just got to find a problem that's big enough that people will pay you to solve it. And I thought that's quite a neat definition of a successful business idea, I'd imagine, because I think ideas are 10 a penny, but sort of stepping up and actually getting active on them is definitely one thing. So starting all these businesses, different businesses, I'm going to leap straight to a question that I'd sort of scheduled for the end, but you said you sort of co-founded them. Yeah, what for you kind of makes a successful startup team? What's the sort of magic sauce?
I think it's more like a sort of a vinaigrette dressing. Actually, there are many sauces that you can have with but the ingredients have some commonality, right? So I mean, I suppose the one thing I really gravitate towards is people with sort of passion, and that doesn't mean they have to be sort of extroverts who wear their sort of passion on their sleeve and can convey that to people they talk to. But we've got a lot of programmers that work for us. They are sort of passionate about what they do, but they don't always explain it in the way that I might be explaining it. So that's the dedication, that passion, and that sort of means that they think about the things a lot, right? So and I think that's one of the things I really, really value a lot, actually. So that's one. I think, and we talked a little bit about sort of words that aren't the ideal words because they can get confusing, or their meanings are confusing to people, or different meanings to different people. But I think I really also like diversity. And I don't just mean sort of ethnic diversity, and I don't just mean gender diversity. I mean people who think differently. And that could be because of their background. It could be because of a whole bunch of different things. But, and I would include those other two things there too. But I just really, the people that sort of sit there and go, well, actually, I wouldn't have done it that way, and here's a better way of doing it. Or, the experience I've had in this other industry means that, I think we can bring something else to the table here. Because, one of the difficulties we face in any silo, of which, insurance, reinsurance is clearly one, is this issue of, well, we've never done it this way before. If there's one thing that gets the sort of hairs on the back of my neck sort of sitting up, it's when people go, well, we've never done it that way before. It's like, well, that is just the reason to try and do something different. It's like, don't give me that as an excuse for why we're not going to introduce and change, or we may need to introduce and change.
I mean, I wrote a LinkedIn post the other day because it made me so cross, because I got faced with that the other day saying, oh, we've never done it that way. And I was like, well, it doesn't mean you shouldn't. And you know, most every change that's positive comes at that point. We've never done it this way, let's try it. Oh, that's better, let's keep doing it that way. So unless that can never be a reason not to do something. And I think that diversity point is incredibly important, because it's the diversity of people along things like lines of gender and you know, sexuality or race, and it's different experiences is what we're talking about, and that's what brings different ideas, isn't it? That's why diversity across all strata is important, because you need a bunch of people in the room that aren't going to group think. You know, one of the things that's come out of successful startup teams, in my experience, is having not a safe space. That sounds like that's a bit too public sector for me.
You can't use that word anymore. That's another one. You see, it's been hijacked. You see that it's been hijacked and used for other things. I use it occasionally, and then I realise that actually people get confused about it. But yes, sorry.
But a robust, but like fair place to debate an idea. You know, that's for me a massive building blocks. You need to be able to disagree. But then this is the challenge of kind of startup pairs. I was talking to someone the other day, and they were talking about going into business as a trio, and I said that's perfect, because you need to be able to outvote somebody. Because that ability to kind of challenge ideas, particularly because startups generally are not created equal. Someone has a strength in one area. Have you found that? Have you found that the successful part of it is delineation of kind of roles and responsibilities? Is that really important as well?
I did a lot more of that when I worked for a big reinsurance broker, where obviously you have to have more structure. Now, I think actually there's less about roles and responsibilities formally. You know, I never much liked titles. I at one point refused to have business cards with a title on it that looked sort of quite flash. Because I said I want to be judged by what people think I am, not what they think I should be. And on top of which, there'll be meetings that I'd be in where, you know, in those days, I'd be working with some smart actuary, might be quite have a low title, but they were actually doing all the talking. And I'm sitting there actually not really contributing. They're much more important than me in that meeting. And then, of course, you can flip it and turn it around. So now I think the issue about roles, I think, to begin with, you want some fluidity, because you want people to think about the design of a structure. You want people to think about and ask the questions. You know, you want the programmer to ask questions about, are end users really going to do that? You know, and you know, I've had lots of instances before where programmers will go, they actually try and do too much design sometimes, and they'll go, well, this is how you should use it. You see, and I'd sort of say, well, actually, you know, I don't think you should be defining how people should be using it at this stage. Let's ask them how they should be using it, and then we should be designing it around that. So I think less so about the formality of that. But of course, in small companies, theoretically large ones too, you really have to have that focus though. So you may not have very rigid roles, but you definitely have to make sure that you're focused on delivering certain things in a certain period of time, because you cannot afford to fail some key delivery, or, you know, you're always right on the edge of somewhere between. Well, in fact, you're right on the edge of failure. You know, you're never in a position of, this is just, or very rarely in a position where you're going to be, you know, successful almost whatever you do. That's a luxury I've never been in anyway, put it that way. But I have always been on the edge of failure, because that's that visceral sort of focus that it brings with it really drives a lot of stuff. It drives, you know, well, it certainly drives energy, and it can drive performance. It can also actually produce stress, of course, as well. But anyway, so I think, no, very informal roles perhaps to begin with, and then at least in a sort of meeting setting, right? And then a division of responsibility, if you like, little projects and little key roles, and then you end up in, yes, you're sort of then pigeonholed for the purposes of that project, and you go and do something, and then you come back together again, and you can have that fluidity again. I think that's how I like to think that we try and operate. Yeah,
I think so. I mean, that there's still there's a drifting towards your natural skill set, you know, but no, I think with this, particularly when you were kind of in I think what everyone's termed the European model of kind of startup, which is have an idea, bootstrap it, make it happen, then maybe go out and get some investment, and as opposed to the US, and it's a massive blanket statement, but you know the US seems to be have an idea, go get some funding, make it happen. And I think some of my reticence about that is that I'm probably more in your school of thought. I've never worked harder than when I can see I've got a couple of months rent left and go, right, okay, well, we need to get this really, really going. And it sharpens the mind, and I think it's healthy. And I think on that edge is a good place to be as an entrepreneur. Not forever. I mean, it's too painful, I think. But I think on the edge, you start to think more about things like the customer, you know, because you're trying to deliver more efficiently and better. So yeah, I would agree with you. Something I wanted to sort of pick your brains on. We've talked about this previously, but what does innovation mean to you? The one of those poison terms, but what does it mean to you?
Yeah, I think we share. I always, when somebody mentions that word, and in your particular case, I've got a bit of context to understand sort of where you're coming from. But when I don't understand where people are coming from, I'm a bit nervous because, you know, there's a sort of, it's become one of those things that people have been talking about explicitly a lot in the last few years. And I think that's really weird because, you know, the foundations of successful human existence as a really early sort of starting point, but continuing to sort of corporate success is all about innovation. So every single company needs to build in innovation into its DNA. Otherwise, the sort of Darwinian process will kill it off very, very, very quickly. Unless it's a monopoly or something else like that, in which case it can survive longer without having innovation. But so innovation needs to be there completely. And the successful companies are the ones that embed it in every single sort of individual in the organization. And that's what gives it life. So when you get people that are in charge of innovation, that's not necessarily a bad thing per se, but it would make me a bit nervous because it sometimes implies in some organizations that other people aren't required to do it. And if that's the case, then I think that's a very difficult position to run a company in or to invest in a company in that's built like that. You know, my sort of the story I like about on the innovation side was 3M had a fantastic set of results when they sort of really pioneered the development of Post-it notes, you know, which were a thing once. I'm not sure they are quite so much, but anyway, they were once a big thing, right? And they made them a ton of money. And at some investor meeting, the CEO was talking about how the results have been so fantastic, and you know, it's down to their brilliance as a company. And some smart analyst said, yeah, but hang on a second. There's a story which I believe is true, and this is true, that they were trying to invent a really good glue and to do something, and it failed as a good glue, but it just worked to create enough stickiness so but it would re-stick and re-stick a bit like the Post-it notes do. And they invented the Post-it notes based on this failure. And the CEO's response was, no, you don't understand. You know, yes, there was a mistake that was made, or no, it wasn't a mistake. It was part of the process of developing a new glue, produced something that didn't really work for what it was intended for. And because innovation is embedded throughout our firm, we didn't just go, it was a failure. We turned a failure into a fantastic success that made the company tons of money because every individual was focusing on innovation. So, you know, that I think, you know, I quite like that story because it shows, if it's true, that actually the really good organizations are one that embed innovation in all elements. And, you know, underwriters in insurance need to think about new policies, and they need to think about how they're introducing climate change and, you know, everything else that goes with it, how AI should be operating. And it isn't some closeted department that says we are doing innovation. And I think I'm always concerned when you see that, see these little specialist units that sort of doing stuff. And that doesn't mean, you know, that there are lots of examples of big organizations that had sort of development units. That's, I think, a different thing. You know, I think that's fine to do that. So you can operate it that way. And, you know, all sorts of people like, you know, Kodak and others used to do all these things, and, you know, and people still do. So it's all right to have a sort of development unit, but you've still got to have innovation embedded throughout the whole organization if you're going to be successful, I think.
Yeah, I mean, on a similar note, I think the thing I always like to think about is the matchbox. I forget what brand it was, but that you used to have a striking plate on both sides, and then someone just pointed out, well, why don't we just have a striking plate on one side and obviously save half the cost? And that's innovation, but the understanding that didn't come from a R&D department, it didn't come from an innovation team. It just someone just pointed that out from the shop floor, and you go, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And I think that's one of the questions I was looking to ask you, which I think has kind of been answered, is just that how important is culture, and that kind of answers it. Culture, you have to have a culture of innovation, but I don't think innovation is the right term. It's more about open collaboration or something like that, because it's enabling ideas to come from not this siloed innovation team. Because one thing that I've seen as a trend, this is absolutely not universally true, but certainly when I've looked at kind of innovation teams, the profiles of those individuals are quite similar. As a person who works in recruitment, the profile of those persons tend to be ex-management consultancy, those types of kind of, and there's there's a genre of thinking there. So you worry that you're getting people with great skills, but you're also getting a certain way of thinking. So, and groupthink is dangerous, I think, when it comes to innovation.
Yeah, I think about culture in the organizations. I suppose there's two things I'd say. One is, I run small organizations, and therefore changing culture, and you can sort of change the culture. The whole of the company can hear what I say if I'm in the office talking. So I can sit there and go, we've really got to be better at this. And there's a potentially a subtle change in culture when I do things like that, because presumably people listen, sort of thing. And of course, people's responses to that will change that too. So much harder, of course, in big organizations to try and do that. I think that the things that matter to me are really things like honesty and openness, and allowing everybody to have a say. And I think that's because I just think that's important to do. That's how I'd like to think I behave like that generally. I should say that there is an opposite approach to that, which is quite difficult sometimes to reconcile with that, which is around leadership and driving some activity. So on the one hand, I will be listening to people, but sometimes they'll be saying, well, should we just do it this way? And I'm absolutely certain the answer is no. So I will say, no, not, I've sort of listened, although they might not actually appreciate that I have listened, but we're going to do it we're not going to do it that way. So actually, this sort of, I think listening and getting everybody's input doesn't negate the need for actually sort of leadership. And there's a very fine balance between listening and sort of when to stop listening and to start leading, because in the small organizations that I run, you absolutely have to take a leadership position. I mean, I started Oasis Loss Modelling Framework because I sort of thought, well, who's going to do this? Somebody needs to fix this problem. And I'd been used to, up till that point, there'd always been a CEO or somebody above me in the organizations that I was working in that sort of did this stuff, and I was really supporting them. So I would often say to them, hey, don't you think we should be doing more of this? And here's why this needs to change. And I think there's some information here. And they'd go yes or no. And the board of the company I used to work for, would decide these things. And they didn't always agree, of course, but they did something. And I just woke up one morning and really looked around me and realized that nobody was going to do this. And somebody actually said to me, you're the best person to do this. And I was slightly shocked, because there were always somebody better above me. But actually, if you looked at skills around 20 odd years of experience in account modeling and a bunch of other things, it wasn't obvious who else was going to do this. So I had to do it. So the leadership thing has to be there in these particularly small companies from day one. I think the bigger ones can actually be a little bit more collaborative, because you've got sort of depth and strength in an organization, and you presumably you've got a mature business. And so I think culture, is really important to try and create that, much more important in the big companies. I actually quite often speak to people, particularly usually with an analytical sort of background, who are trying to get into insurance. And I sometimes see them, before they go for an interview, and I try and sort of give a little bit of coaching as to what they should ask and what they should do. And I always say, other than preparing for questions they get asked, I say, here's a good question you should ask them about the culture of the company. And in my experience, it's one of the hardest questions for senior people in the insurance and reinsurance industry to actually answer. They often say, oh, that's a good question. and then try to articulate what it is, because, it's not something you're going to obviously see in some organizations. And in others, the culture might not be entirely one you'd want to tell people about, put it that way. So and culture's so it's so crucial in the recruitment process. That's something that obviously speaks to my world. And you often get asked about culture, and this is where things like remote working and the situation we're in now is slightly difficult, because one of the key things is you go and visit clients and you'd meet them and you'd meet the team and you'd see the offices and you get that sort of touch and feel for something. And in this sort of remote world working that we're in now, that's kind of difficult, but it does play out in how people communicate. So how we're kind of going to view culture and working relationships and working environments is going to be really challenging, I think, going forward. But yeah, that's such a great stumbling thing, because you always ask people, well, what's the culture here? And most of the time people say work hard, play hard. and then you go, well, what does that even mean? And the good thing is we've now got a lot more facility to look inside a company, whether it be via things like Glassdoor or just how they present themselves on social media, what they choose to share, initiatives they choose to get involved with, but doesn't kind of get away from the water cooler gossip, particularly in insurance, because most people have been, if you've been in the market a long time, enough people in your network that you can find out. So cultures. I do share the empathy though with them that culture on a big scale is very difficult to change. I'm a one-man band, so my culture has changed if I fall out of bed in the wrong side in the morning. Changes overnight. I think I just want to get your that phrase, work hard, play hard, which I might have used myself a few times going back 20, 30 years, or I think I probably have. Because I think I remember a time that seemed to me to make sense. Mm-hmm. Now I just think if somebody said that to me, I'm afraid. I think, and I'm not saying you saying this is your view, right?
Oh no.
But I think that's a pretty dumb phrase, actually. I don't want somebody to work hard, but that's not the defining, because I think then people go, oh, I've been in the office until 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock or something, or that they're going to start trying to quantify it by that. I want people to be smart. Right? Mm-hmm. Work smart is so much a much more important thing, and I've found over the years, the recent years anyway, I mean, I've ended up in a position, anybody that's got relatively small companies, you can never stop in some respects unless you make yourself stop. And I definitely found myself working too much at weekends, and just what would take me on a Tuesday morning, would take me half an hour, would take me an hour and a half on a weekend, because I just didn't have a clear enough head. I was just slow. I needed that break, so I have definitely, sort of, and actually this year with the coronavirus and these various lockdowns, I found to begin with that I just couldn't actually work beyond 5 or 6 in the evening, because I've just spending the whole day in front of a damn screen and trying to get everything else done. I just didn't have the energy in the evening to do anything, and I decided just not to. So I would just stop, and even though, as we all were mostly anyway, working at home, I would leave my home office and go in the garden or go and do something else, or go for a walk or whatever, because I just need to create that separation. So definitely for me, working smarter. I'm not quite sure what playing hard means either, but that's probably, I think, pretty dumb as well. I don't like that phrase, I've decided.
No, I'm with you. And yeah, I certainly I think it does speak to that. And, I've worked in those cultures, and look, I mean, recruitment, headhunting, whatever you want to call it, is effectively quite a lot of it's a sort of sales culture. And I remember working with people that so clearly were just trying to outweigh everyone going home, and then they would go home last. And that's, if that's the culture that you've imbued in your business, then then that's really, really negative and damaging. And you know, and you're not being efficient. I mean, that person is making less per hour than they should be because they're spending too many hours in the office. But I wanted to speak to you about something that is obviously sort of inherent in the businesses that you run, which is the sort of importance of partnerships and collaborations in an industry towards a culture of kind of change and innovation. Obviously, you think it's important because of the nature of the things you've been involved with, but how do you make that happen? And I suppose probably, yeah, I suppose how did you make it happen rather than how does anyone make it happen? But how do you make that sort of partnership, collaboration across an industry happen? Because one would imagine that's a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I think about this a fair bit, and I've had a few questions in the past about this, and I still don't think I've got a very good answer, but I'll do my best. I think that actually for me, the starting point is I just think instinctively my character is I'd quite like to build consensus. You know, I mean, I don't really understand the sort of mentality of sort of here's my viewpoint, you know, like it or leave it sort of thing. I mean, I think that just sounds a bit odd. So I come from a position, I think, perhaps instinctively of wanting to build consensus. And I think when I then moved into through a sort of career in business, I sort of realized that actually, you know, sales is a classic example, right? You can look at sales as being, and this is people who don't understand sales. They think it's something about making something do something, making them buy something they didn't necessarily know they wanted. You know, which if you think that's what sales is, you know, you obviously sort of don't really understand it. You know, it's about understanding what your customer or your client wants, and then finding a way to explain what you have that fits into what they want, you know. And I think that even with sales, which by its nature, you still need, of course, at some point say, well, look, you know, you're going to buy it, you're not going to buy it, that you get to that stage. But even so, I think it's much more of a collaborative process than people that don't understand sales really understand. Now, if you then look at a much more, where this stuff really matters though, is in around the complexity that exists in all businesses and in society. So I looked around the place and I said, look, we want to compete on a whole bunch of different things, but actually the industry is terribly inefficient, and there are ways of solving some problems for all of us. In fact, there is the only way to solve those problems for all of us is by collaboration, or otherwise it's going to be some existential threat that comes in and changes us all. And I think that's where really I think the insurance industry is right now. It's it's massively uncompetitive in a sense because its cost base is so high, right? And I've looked at, in London it's 40 points plus of the of a dollar a premium or whatever currency is the cost base just to keep the lights on, and that's a very high number. And I haven't really done any research on this, but when I looked around the place to try and find well who else has cost ratios of that high, the only one I could find that's more is the banking sector, which is a bit more than that. And I'm thinking, I don't think that's a very good position to be in, right? So, there is not a shortage of people around the industry saying we need to improve, right? And improving doesn't mean shaving 2 points off your combined ratio, because that there has to be a goal to be, substantially cheaper in how you offer this service. And so we've really got to, so therefore we've got not much time to make significant changes. And the best way I think to do that is via collaboration. And so to your question that's more about the why than the how. I think the how part is complicated, but it starts with building trust. And that trust partly comes from, experience definitely helps with trust to some degree, right? So it's easier for me to walk into somebody that I've known for 20, 30 years to say, hey, I think there's something here that's quite radically different you should be thinking about. That conversation is much easier when you've already got some residual element of trust that you built up over in my case, a fairly long career. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. But the trust, of course, that doesn't, that's not the only way that it's done. So I think that in my case, I've been really clear to try and keep the sort of the core businesses that I run being not for profit, and I have often turned down commission and positions on boards that would be paid from certain organizations because I thought it would cloud the perspective I have when I walk into, well, I used to walk into an office anyway, and I can look at people and I can say, look, I've got no skin in the game here, but here's a better way of solving this problem that we all have. And so I think, those are the things that I guard very carefully. I try and make sure that I can hopefully convey trust. Simple things like I never write speeches because I think people that read speeches lose that visceral connection that you get when you have somebody that is sort of speaking from their heart and from their head rather than from a bit of paper that may or may not have been written by them. So, I just say what I think. And I think that means that it's easier to make a connection with people when you do that. And one of the difficulties, of course, you've already mentioned about, the whole coronavirus stuff is that, it's harder to get in front of people. It's harder for us to sort of to meet and form those bonds with people that you don't know or haven't seen, or you've got a complicated sell. So I think the collaboration thing is around there, but there's it's very, very hard. And I think the insurance industry is better than many industries at doing it, but not good enough. There's too many examples of mistakes being made around collaboration. And I think the other thing, by the way, about collaboration is, and this is one of the most exciting things in my space, is the collaboration isn't just between insurance, reinsurance companies and brokers, and we're, Oasis doing a lot of that right now, and that's sort of great. But we're also moving into developing countries, and I was talking to a bunch of bankers in the Philippines who might want to use cat models yesterday, and this morning there was a webinar with the European Union talking about how we can solve climate change, and actually the role that insurance plays in society. If you ask the average individual in the street, do you trust insurance and bankers and everybody else? The answer is always no. We're very low on their threshold of trust. And that's a shame, because actually the core value of insurance is so fundamental to sustaining a resilient society. So, the more that we can do to help the man and woman in the street understand about risk, understand about why insurance makes sense, understand what a 1 in 100-year loss is, all of these things that are the sort of day-to-day bread and butter of the insurance industry. I think the better off the insurance industry will be, and there's a greater likelihood that we'll survive longer than we may do otherwise if we don't learn to be able to do that.
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly with almost everything you said there. But I think one thing I wanted to pick up on is that I think that's the appeal for me with insurance. I mean, I've sort of flirted with other industries where there's a crossover, whether it be insurance and risk managers into kind of sort of heavy chemical industries or whatever, or when I've ran teams and they've been tech focused and I've been dealing with tech companies. But I always kind of revert course back to the insurance industry because it's quite unique in its collaboration. I mean, Lloyd's is obviously a very obvious example, but the fact that we've got a subscription marketplace, and that's so alien to so many other industries. And speaking to sort of colleagues when I was employed in places that did other industries, they couldn't understand that you could pick up the phone to someone that you don't know and get a meeting and grab a coffee, and people were very willing to talk. They were quite willing to engage. Although someone said to me the other day, the first coffee is always 3, and the second one, you need to provide the value, which I've always thought is probably true. But yeah, we are uniquely positioned because there's something about the industry that we're usually collaborating. Big events tend to hit multiple parties. There are things that are kind of inherent in the way that we do business that means that we have to trade and communicate with each other. So we're quite well placed for collaboration, I would imagine.
Yeah, no, I think we're definitely better than others, but because I spend so much of my time trying to make it work. Collaboration is much more than a willingness to sit around the table with people you may be your competitors to solve problems.
Yeah.
I think that's obviously again the culture. Getting back to the culture has to allow you to start having those conversations. But the bit that really matters, and the bit that in my experience I've done badly myself I tend to, hopefully I'm better at it now, but is you've got to run these collaboration exercises like you run any project, right? You can't just do this with part-time participation from willing people. We're going to introduce a new thing. Wouldn't that be cool? New piece of software, new standard, whatever else it is. That will not work unless you have the rigor that is part of all projects, like, project manager, and you can use whatever titles you want for these things, but essentially you need a project manager, you need a project plan, you need people to make commitments of time or money or both. And those are the things that make things work. And Oasis essentially, it started, we called it a project for the first couple of years because we didn't know whether or not it would be a long-term thing. It turned into a company, but it's got all of those aspects. Obviously now it's a company, it's got, a decent number of people in it, so it's maybe a bit easier. And we're sort of looking a little bit to expand it. We're doing much more on standards than we ever were before. And of course our software is open source, which is a really, one of the most, mature, perhaps mature is the wrong word for it, but one of the most interesting areas of collaboration, right? So all of our software is, you can download it online. You can make changes to it if you're a programmer and you've got the skills. You can make suggested changes to that software, and from many examples like Linux, and there's many Apache, all sorts of ones these days. I think that's a really interesting space to be in. But even there again, if you look at what people like Linux do, it's not like there are thousands of programmers around the world tinkering with Linux, going, oh, this little thing here, this little thing there. There's a lot of directed activity from the Linux Foundation to make it do what it needs to do. It's not a free form set of activity. And I think that's the big thing about collaboration for me. It's, yes, you need people to get together. Yes, sometimes you want them to be volunteers, but often when people say to me, well, we'll just ask for volunteers, I said, please don't. Please do not ask for volunteers, because sometimes the people that volunteer aren't the ones you really want, right? Yeah. So sometimes I a lot go to companies and people and I say, will you help on this project? And they go, well, I'm a bit busy. And I said, well, I know you're a bit busy because you're good and you've got a demanding job, but I need you to work on this project because of the skills that you've got. So I often think that actually, therefore, it's less about people volunteering. They may think they volunteered, but actually, you sometimes have to target the right people. And we all, the people that I know in the collaboration space, that's what they do all the time, right? Yeah. So it's still focused. The culture is around collaboration, but it's still focused. It has to have all the disciplines that any activity in any normal company would have. It's just across industry or across industries, and that's the only difference.
I'd kick myself if I didn't score through that open goal you just laid for me there, Dickie, about the best people don't volunteer, and you have to go and approach. But it is funny because I think, I'm talking to clients all the time, and during this year has been, it's been really difficult for people, but people are at home, so there's more freedom to do things like apply for jobs. And, I was talking to a client that put a job up for 24 hours and they said, oh, we don't need to use recruiters anymore because we had 280 people apply. And I said, right. I said, firstly, good luck sifting through all of those. And secondly, there's no reason to think the right person didn't apply, but a lot of the time the right person isn't available. And I actually came from a not-for-profit. It was the first thing I did in my career, actually, before I got into insurance. And I was in marketing, and it was always a challenge, and a lot of it was about partnerships and trying to sort of pull in favors. And it's exactly that. We'd get really lovely, well-meaning people apply, but I'd go, yeah, this is great, but what do you know about SEO or PPC and actual kind of technical marketing skills, and I'd have to go out and find those people and target them, and exactly as you say, look, I know you're busy. That's kind of why I want you, because you're busy using those skills. So it's a massive challenge. But
Alex, just in case, I just said that I think that there are some people that volunteer that are fantastic, right?
Of course.
But it's not like you can populate the whole, the whole project team with volunteers. That usually doesn't work, because the other thing is there are constituents. You sometimes, there's often we'll say we need somebody from this type of company, a big broker, a big reinsurer, a big insurer, a global something, So you have to look at things like that. So it's a balance between the both. Take some volunteers, because actually there are some volunteers that are really, really good. you know, and really, really useful. But you just need to make sure you've got the right team, which isn't therefore usually going to be populated just by volunteers.
Yeah, and it depends what you're working on, because the things that you're working on, there's going to be people that are inherently interested that have the skills, you know, because of the nature of the work. You know, you're interested in things that are related to your field. But then, yeah, there's I just, in my head, I was picturing when you're picking a football team, there's always some people nobody wants, right? But look, I wanted to, I said it'd be 45 minutes, so I'm conscious to kind of bring it down. But one thing that we had a pre-talk before this one, and I wanted to sort of ask you, one of the sort of questions you posed was sort of a top three. And I didn't put this on the sheet, so I apologise. But you know, what's the top three things that you're most proud of in your work with Oasis? What are the big, most proud of, or big wins that really stick in your mind as things that you're really pleased with?
Look, I have to confess to a bias here. I don't like this idea of pride. I think that isn't that wrong, right? So but I'm happy with your big wins thing. Well, you know, before I started Oasis, I went to talk to a lot of people, and some very large companies and some experienced people. Several people said to me, "Look, you know, it's a nice idea, but what you're trying to do is impossible, and you know, so therefore we're not going to support you because it's impossible." And it just never occurred to me that it was impossible. And I think there's some value to blissful ignorance. You know, if you really don't think sometimes about how difficult it is, you know, and just don't take sort of no for an answer, you can do things. So I suppose just getting it off the ground to begin with was, frankly, felt like some achievement. And after we produced our software in the first 2 years, somebody came up to me and said, "I never thought you were going to do that." I said, "Well, why did you give me the money then?" Well, it wasn't much money and it was worth it, you know. So I think that I'm frankly never satisfied, you know. We're just about to complete raising some more money, which is fantastic, you know, but I'm just moving on to the next problem. I mean, there's always something more to do. So I think that I don't really, I suppose starting it to begin with felt like a good thing to do, and was definitely a bit of a change from my previous career. So that was good. But you know, there's just too many challenges and too many hurdles ahead of me that I can't really look back too much, because it's there's too much to look forward to that I need to focus on, I think, Lou.
Yeah, sensible. Yeah, I mean, and I think it's been a year for, let's say, probably, I think we'd all like to reflect less on this year than many other years that we've had. And 2021 is a very welcome thing that we can see over the horizon now. But look, Dickie, I'll leave it there, because I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I want to thank you once again for your time. Thanks for spending some time with me this morning. Appreciate it.
Alex, thank you. Good to talk.
You're welcome.